This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 222. The Mythical World of NAIRU.
This week, the Federal Reserve said interest rates will remain close to zero in the US, probably through to 2023 at the earliest. Why? Because they don't expect inflation to pick up by then, and they expect unemployment to remain well below where it was. So they keep interest rates down to encourage borrowing, so companies expand and employ people. Then and only then will inflation pick up. That's the theory, because when unemployment gets so low, then we'll start to see wages pick up, and that's what's creating inflation. The point at which that happens is called the NAIRU. But is there such a mythical beast? And if so, why does it keep on changing? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. So, Steve, NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. I suspect you're going to enjoy this episode. This is the point at which unemployment, this is the theory, unemployment becomes so low that there's a shortage of workers, so that's going to push up wages and it's going to lead to inflation. It's the point at which central banks think the economy is running too hot and they need to push up interest rates. So this is important to central banks. The only flaw in all of that argument is that nobody is entirely sure what that rate of NAIRU is, and it seems to move around all the time. And the moment everyone hits it, and nothing happens, they say, "Oh, it must be lower than that," and so it goes on. And that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? When you've got a definitive measure, but the only problem is you don't quite know what that measure actually is.
What's the character in Wind in the Willows? Is it the Will and the Wisp?
Willow the Wisp.
The Will of the Wisp, okay. It's a figment of Milton Friedman's imagination.
Yeah.
That's what NAIRU actually is.
And lots of other people. And every other central bank.
Well, no, let's give the kid who dreamt up the fantasy the first time around his due. It was Milton's dream.
Right.
Because Milton was trying to destroy what he saw as Keynesian economics, which in fact, when you look at it, was actually Samuelsonian economics that dominated America from the 1940s to the 1960s. And he, in typical Milton Friedman fashion, redefined what allegedly Keynesian economics was about. Because if you look at the way that Hicks characterized Keynes, he got him completely, very, very badly wrong in the main. But there's a grain of truth to it, and that's what Hicks described Keynesian economics as the economics of depression. If you're in a depression, how do you get out of it? That was what was novel about Keynes, because initially the mainstream economists thought you couldn't get into a depression because equilibrium, therefore no such thing as depression.
Right.
Ignoring the historical experience of the 1800s, but that's another story. But anyway, you can, to some degree, without completely destroying what Keynes actually spoke about, you can say he was giving advice about how to get out of a depression.
Right. When
you have involuntary unemployment. So there's less work available than there are people who want to do the work at the going wage. And that's what Keynes used as his definition of involuntary unemployment. So people willing to work for the wage going wage, they can't get a job.
So Friedman was arguing that was only a short-term thing, though. So we only...
No, Friedman arguing it didn't exist.
Oh, right, okay.
Okay, we're back in the classical world again. He dreamt up, and this, that's the word I can search for. I searched for the wrong word when I was searching through Milton before we began this podcast, so bear with me doing my usual thing of trying to do two
we'll
things
just
at
talk
once
amongst ourselves
and see if I can pull it off. But if I search in Friedman for helicopter, this is where the concept of helicopter money came up. And what Friedman did was imagine a world in which there was full employment. That's the starting point.
Right.
Okay, you have full employment, and in that fully employed world, there's 1,000 pieces of paper that are called $1 each. And those pieces of paper turn over, I think he had a rate of circulation of 12 times a year. And that turnover of money is what created the level of economic activity. And you were already starting at the point where the economy was in long run equilibrium. Okay. Everybody who wanted a job had a job.
Yeah.
Okay, you're right. And so what the government is trying to do is to push the level of employment below the natural non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Okay. Now, that's not at all what was being attempted under Keynesian policy. You said there was involuntary unemployment. You had people who wanted a job and couldn't get it. The economy was operating well below capacity. So the government, the role of the government in the broadly speaking Keynesian framework was to provide additional aggregate demand so that you eliminated involuntary unemployment.
Yeah.
Instead, Friedman starts on the point of saying you're already at equilibrium and the government's trying to drive it lower. Okay, so it's I'll let you dive into the question there, but that's the framework that Friedman began with.
Well, I mean, going back to my first question, no one actually is really quite sure what that involuntary level of unemployment is in any case, because we, in the United States, if you looked at the Fed Board of Governors, for example, if you look at the history of what their estimates are in the United States, they had NAIRU at over 7% in the 1980s. And, last year unemployment was getting down to 3.5% in the United States. Now you can argue the statistics, but I mean, the approach hasn't changed since the 80s into how it's collected. So you've got it down to 3.5%, and still inflation is not picking up. So that sort of makes you wonder about the theory behind it all, and that really is, I think, what has led to a couple of weeks ago the Federal Reserve in the United States saying, well, we're going to let the economy run hot. We're going to, we've been targeting 2% inflation. 2%. Yeah, we've been targeting 2% inflation. We'll let inflation get a bit higher than that. We'll let it get, maybe even up to 3% before we start to move interest rates. That'll allow us to focus on unemployment. That's almost an admission, isn't it, that none of this is working?
Yeah, I mean, and that's why I use the expression from the wind of the will as the will of the wisp. You're chasing something which is a figment of somebody's imagination. Yeah. And that's why it could never be tied down and defined, because when a physicist or an engineer defines something like mass or weight or acceleration, there's a set mechanics behind its definition, which is true in the reference frame and true in general. Economists come up with these damn things, and they're fantasies. And then they try to measure what's the level of the fantasy in the real world. But of course, that never ties it down. Right.
So, but are you saying that in that case, there isn't a natural level of unemployment? There's not a point.
There isn't.
So, no. Except for zero.
So, the capitalism is a cyclical system. And this is the point which neoclassicals don't want to get their heads around, because they have this vision of reaching equilibrium. And so all the thinking is about this perfect equilibrium point. And they're ideologically biased in favor of equilibrium, because then they can say that you've reached a point where nobody can be made better off without making somebody else worse off. And that's then a social ideal. And as much as they claim to be, value free, there's ideology just through all their expressions: perfect equilibrium, optimality, etc., etc. They're trying to describe capitalism as a system which achieves some level of perfection. And you can only have perfection if you don't have cycles. Now, I could make you into something perfect. I could stop you having cycles. That would involve killing you and freezing you to absolute zero. Right. Would you like that?
Well, if it makes me perfect. Well,
there you go. Okay. So
I've always wanted that.
Their definition of perfection is nonsense. It's the perfection of a dead system.
Right. But I mean, but the idea that unemployment is going to get so low that it's largely structural. So you've got everyone's got a job, apart from those people who are qualified as plumbers, and we've got enough plumbers. Therefore, those plumbers are going to find it hard to find work. I mean, you're going to get a point, aren't you? Which that you can't get down to zero on unemployment, can you?
Well, you could by policy, things like the job guarantee idea like that. But in terms of a cyclical capitalist system, no, it's never going to stop moving. And this is, right. It isn't, this is the whole thing about NAIRU. It's supposed to be a number that doesn't change. And that's the idea of the vision of equilibrium.
Yeah. Pardon? Even though the central banks have been changing it every year for the last decades.
Capitalism is a dynamic system, and the vision that it reaches equilibrium is simply a fallacy about how a dynamic system behaves. Right. A dynamic system of capitalism is subject to external forcing. And the external forcing is that little thing in the sun that you occasionally see, sky and you occasionally see in the UK, called the sun. You're getting more acquainted with it, and as global warming comes your way. But that energy source coming in is what we all effectively mine on the planet to turn into both life and goods and services in our capitalist economy. And we're always fighting over the distribution of income. And if you have a rise in the number of people who've got a job, there's more likely to be less people available to work, whether you have unions demanding wage rises or employers trying to steal workers from each other, you're going to get a change in that value. So it's going to be cyclical. And this whole belief that there's some stable, you're chasing something, you're trying to nail down something that shouldn't be nailed down. If you've ever seen the engineer's flow chart,
no.
Does it move?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, like
yes,
a gang chart.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Should it move?
Yeah.
Yes or no? Okay. If it should move, yes, you use WD-40.
Yeah.
Well, economists will also say using gaffer tape when they're trying to tie it down. It's supposed to move, guys.
Yeah. All right. Okay. And it moves because of changes in the broader economy, but also the structural makeup of work, I guess, and the need to retrain and the delays in all of that, changes in demographics, the whole load of factors which are going into that. So
the feedback, it's a dynamic system between level of output, level of income distribution, level of debt. They all play on each other. It's always going to be moving. And the cyclicality, you have to accept that initially and give up on the idea you can get it to stop it moving.
So does that mean then that, well, two things. The Phillips curve, does that mean we can completely discount that now? Because, I mean...
No.
Okay, well, so we'll come on to that. But also, does it mean that the idea of NAIRU is, I mean, the central banks just shouldn't focus on that number. I mean,
it should be thrown out with the bathwater.
So we'll come back to the Phillips curve in a sec. So they, but they have to focus on employment, don't they? I mean, that is an important part of what they're doing. So they've got to have goals. What do they work towards?
Well, first of all, you accept that it's cyclical. This is if you go back to seeing Phillips, and Phillips is one of the geniuses of economics who has been neglected and distorted by the mainstream. But Phillips was an engineer, New Zealander engineer as it happens, who took across concepts from electronics into economics and designed a circuit, the very first circuit diagram of capitalism back in the 1950s. And as part of it said there'll be a tendency for prices to rise when there's extreme pressure on resources, which he defined pretty broadly as both raw materials, input and labour, and said that therefore you're going to get an effect which is a very non-linear relationship between the level of economic activity and the rate of change of factor prices, said in general, meaning largely labour and raw materials. And so he drew that shape. He literally hand drew it. And
that's been translated, though, hasn't it, to be just labour? I mean, that has... But
Phillips made one huge mistake, and that is... Well, not you. He's used to working with engineers who look at something and then will take the idea and refine it and improve it. He did it to economists who just bastardized it completely. So by arguing there's some relationship between the level of economic activity and the rate of change of factor prices, he then went looking for the level of rate of economic growth and the level of unemployment and the rate of change of money wages. That's the relationship he looked at. And he managed to pull together about 4 or 5 data series because the data wasn't formally recorded until the 1940s from trade unions and stuff like that. I think he had data from 1867 until 1967, pretty much a century. No, 57, 90 years. And he fitted the data to one part of it by breaking the annual data he had for the unemployment rate and the rate of change of money wages into 7 numbers, literally just 7 numbers, 7 pairs of numbers. And then he drew a curve through it and fitted the curve to a hyperbolic function. And that's what became the Phillips curve.
Right.
And when you look at the verbal explanation he gave, he said there are 3 factors which can influence the rate of change of money wages. One is the level of unemployment, and that's all that goes into the Phillips curve. But you're saying the second is the rate of change of unemployment. If unemployment's rising, workers are less likely to demand wage rises. Okay, and of course firms are less likely to offer. So it's the level, the rate of change, and he then said also cost push inflation acting largely through what he thought were changes in trade, tariffs and access to the mainland. Of course, we had 2 world wars in the data he was looking at.
That is a
so
far
he
more...
had 3 factors.
Right, which is much more sophisticated than that graph that we see, which is basically saying if there's not many jobs around, then people can't push for wage increases, and if there's lots of jobs...
There's no way that he could have done a sophisticated 3-factor statistical fit, because in the end, he had 7 numbers. Yeah. If you have 3 factors for 7 numbers, you can draw anything. So it wasn't his fault that he just reduced it just to the level of unemployment. That's all he could use. But in the full sense of the word, his vision is the level of unemployment, the rate of change, and the feedback effect between price raises and money wages.
Right. And we're seeing that now, of course. We're seeing, there's a big rate of change in unemployment. Nobody is going to, and we're getting deflation. Nobody's going to be asking for a wage increase right now, because everyone's sitting back thinking, oh my God, I'm just so glad I've still got a job.
That's right. And of course, we've also broken the backs of the trade unions in the meantime. So they're not about to go bargaining there. So, you have a world which is completely different to the world in which NAIRU would exist. And the whole NAIRU, the point about the accelerating side of that, but I might as well explain that for people who haven't suffered through reading any of Milton Friedman's nonsense. But what he argued was you had this is where the helicopter money idea came in. So he had this idea of a fixed amount of money. There were 1,000 $1 notes circulating in this economy. I think he had it circulating 12 times a year. So 1,000 dollars created $12,000 per year of GDP. Then a helicopter flies over the top of the country, okay, and that moves the stick from 1,000 $1 notes to 2,000 $1 notes. And by increasing the amount of money, people run around and pick up the money, and they think, oh, there's more demand out there, and they go shopping because they want to have a certain. I think he wants to have. They want to have 1/12 of a year's expenditure in their pocket at any particular time. That's the amount of money, something like that. And then suddenly they've got 1/6. Well, they spend it to get back to the 1/12 again. That causes inflation. And then you go to a higher price level. And then what he had was not just a single helicopter flying over, but this is, apocalypse now. A whole flying planes. Hey, I've got the landscape here. Flying over the landscape, dropping money out, and that's going to, that people get adjusted to a rate of inflation occurring. But it's all in equilibrium. Again, he's presuming the market's the economy's in equilibrium. And why are prices rising? Because people expect the helicopters to fall over, and they're automatically putting up their prices, even though all markets are in equilibrium. It is a delusional load of twaddle. But that's, and then here comes this idea of NAIRU, and you get 40 years of poor bloody neoclassically trained economists who don't realise where this garbage comes from, that spend their time trying to chase the will-o'-the-wisp.
So I don't know how closely you've been following the Fed, but they've had a 1-year appraisal of their monetary policy, and the upshot of it seems to be very slight, in that they've said, we've been targeting an NAIRU rate an inflation rate, I should say, of 2%. And now we're going to be a little bit more, rough around the edges on that. We might allow it to go up to 3%. We'll allow it to be symmetrical. So it's been below 2% for a long time. So we can probably accept that it'll go above 2% for quite a while before we feel that we have to move interest rates. That's sort of like an admission of the fact that they don't really know why inflation isn't going anywhere. It's not going to go to 2% in a hurry. It's certainly not going to go to 3%, possibly in yours and my lifetime, Steve. It's possible, isn't it, that we're going to be stuck with very low inflation. And they've said in terms of jobs, that'll allow us to focus more on trying to get jobs back. So that's like a saying, well, okay, isn't it? And an admission that NAIRU is wrong. We don't know what it is. We're going to get it. We're going to get it wrong. And if it means that we see a rise in inflation because we've focused too hard on trying to get productive jobs back, then so be it. Doesn't that sound like you an admission? They're just saying, oh, it's just a small thing. We're just changing our inflation target. But beneath all that, I just wonder whether they're saying, yeah, and that is because we have no idea at what point inflation is going to kick in, because because the economy is running too hot because because of the job number.
I think that's pretty realistic. You have a bunch of people following a theory which is wrong. It's effectively they're people wandering around the desert with a map saying X marks the spot. and X keeps on moving. Each time they dig up a hole where the X is supposed to be, there's nothing in the sand. And they're finally going to say, well, maybe this map's useless. So we're going to, maybe, move, change what we're doing and see what happens. They're finally doing experimental economics on the entire American economy rather than following a fundamentally fallacious theory that they think should work because they have no other idea of how to draw a map.
Yeah, never mark an X on sand in the desert because it does blow away and move around. Yeah, I think that's very true. So what does the Fed is also saying, that we need to look more at income equality in the United States as well. And I'm not quite sure how. I mean, they've got pretty much a blunt instrument, haven't they? I mean, unemployment rates vary by sector, by income brackets. What can the Fed do? I mean, that really is government policy, isn't it, to try and tackle that?
It really is. That's Treasury
taxes,
policy.
Yeah, fiscal stimulus, employment regulations, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, but the Fed has made things worse through QE. And in that sense, they really can take the blame here, and they should. Because, again, if you read the original documents from Ben Bernanke on why he was undertaking QE, it was because he thought it caused the wealth effect. He was going to increase the price of stocks, make people feel wealthier. They would then consume out of their wealth as well as out of their income, and that would boost the economy. Never even considering, if he did, it was pretty juvenile. Who has shares? The working class? No, they can kiss my ass, as the old song goes. They've got no money at all. They certainly haven't got much in the way of shares. It benefits the wealthy. Do the wealthy spend a lot of their money? No, but that's where it went. So it's trying to boost the economy by boosting the wealthy when they'd already been boosted by the preceding stock market bubble and the level of credit. So the Fed has made inequality worse. And the only way they can really go about fixing it up is by reducing share prices, which they're not about to do, or by doing something that directly provides money for ordinary people, which is what I wish they would do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly share prices are nuts in the United States. I mean, don't they know there's a pandemic on? We've got almost every day a record-breaking share price happening.
That is a topic for another day again, but that appears to be just a range of effective trades that are taking place in the options market.
Well, a lot of it is the retail. I mean, it is a topic for another day, but a lot of it is the retail market rather than institutional investors moving in. It's people who've perhaps got a bit of money because they are not spending it on train fares or whatever, got a bit of spare cash, so they're putting it into speculative investments in share prices. So there's
day traders. What we need more of.
It's going to come down. It's going to come falling down, isn't it? So, but on this income distribution thing, Donald Trump's been arguing, and he is right on this. It depends, you can twist statistics, but before the pandemic, black unemployment in America was down to 5.1%, which is the lowest it's been since 1975, and it's well down on 19%, which is where it was in 2010. So I wonder how much of that, that blunt instrument of low interest rates, encouraging investment and creating jobs, it's been doing something, hasn't it?
Yeah, and then that's one of the, I think, modern monetary theory arguments. If you're providing that stimulus to demand of the economy, it's going to largely go into people's wages and salaries, and it'll boost the low end of town more than it boosts the high end of town. So deficit spending is a much more effective policy than QE.
But is this deficit spending, or is it just the fact that interest rates are so low?
Oh, it's both. I mean, but the interest rates themselves the low interest rates don't stimulate investment. This is one of the problems that, again, the mainstream way of thinking, and this is where Hicks is responsible. Hicks bastardized the general theory. He actually, what he called was his ISLM model, which he called was a model of Keynes, he actually wrote in 1935, before Keynes wrote the general theory, let alone before Hicks himself read the general theory. And as part of that, he had a future which was absolutely known. So people knew had a perfect foresight, and other these ludicrous concepts in mainstream economics. With perfect foresight, you know what's going to work as investments in 2,000 years. So the only thing that can change how much you're going to invest is the rate of interest, because that reduces the net present value of future gains. So investment was entirely controlled by the interest rate. Now, in Keynes, it was controlled by expectations of future profit, much more volatile. So if you say interest rates are the only thing determining investment, you're living in a world where you know the future. Okay? No, we don't live in that world. We live where you don't know the future, so interest rates are irrelevant compared to expectations.
So when you've got So when you've got central banks that were saying, our job is to make sure the economy is not running too hot. We're going to do that by controlling interest rates, and we're also going to keep an eye on inflation. Now, on unemployment, I should say, and unemployment numbers. Now saying, well, actually, we're going to focus a lot more on unemployment, and we're going to be a little less concerned about the other factors because we think they may be driven off that. If that's the approach which is being taken now, I mean, I just wonder about what that means for the independence of central banks, because as we've just been saying, a lot of that is actually the job of governments to do, and a lot of it's hard to do with the blunt instruments that central banks have got available to them. I'm just wondering we've seen lately anyway, that the whole independence between the Treasury and central banks, they're having to work together to get their way through this COVID crisis. So isn't this an example of the fact that they cannot be independent? They need to work together to get an effective result.
No, that's true. And this is, again, modern monetary theory's argument that the Federal Reserve is a branch of government. And the whole idea that central bank independence is a good idea basically had two sides to it. One is when you had high inflation and you believed that you could reduce it by putting up interest rates, then the people making those decisions were politicians, and they didn't enjoy doing unpopular stuff. So politicians were quite happy to hand that responsibility over to the central bank if the central bank insisted upon it. But the central bank at the same time was staffed by people who believed you could control inflation and everything else using the interest rate. Now, we've had 40 years of doing that, and look where they are. They've got to admit they can't control anything. So in some ways it's learning by experience once more and saying, well, maybe we should work with the government a bit more because effectively we've tried 40 years of what the theory told us would work and it hasn't.
So when you look at trying to change the structure of employment, I mean, the big issues we've been facing, obviously, it's the income divide, the fact that unemployment is much higher in lower income groups. Well, it stands to reason that's part of the reason they're a lower income group lots of the time because they don't have a job. But then you've also got long-term unemployment. You've got youth unemployment. If you look at all of those factors, they have actually been improving over the last 10 years, and not just in America, but all over the world. So if you look at youth unemployment, let's look at Australia, for example, around 12% in the last decade. Actually, it's over 16% now with the coronavirus, but it was tracking down. In the UK, it got as high as 22% in 2012, but it's been going down. And long-term unemployment, we've seen that decreasing as well. So it was over 4% at the time of the GFC. It's down to below 1%. The same in the UK, except it never got as high as 4% in the UK, but it's down around 1% now. So all of those factors, looking at the distribution of jobs, looking at, according to income, we're looking at youth unemployment, and and what was the other one I was talking about? All those factors are all improving over the last decade. So what's driving that? Well,
largely, again, QE is not entirely an effective policy. With QE, you create lots of money on the finance sector, but some of it has to dribble into the middle economy. So there has been a boost in that sense. Even you've also had governments running deficits. Even though they protested about it, they've still been doing it. So there's government money spending creation coming in that way. And after the initial collapse of credit in the financial crisis, you're back to some moderate levels of credit. So you've got three factors giving you monetary demand, and you still have the overall, though it's much lower than it was in the 50s and 60s, rate of technological innovation in capitalism giving you some real growth as well. Well, I think the real crunch we're facing now is something which is irrelevant. It was independent of all those, and that's access to energy and the capacity to use energy in global warming. And I think we're hitting a crunch point now with that, where we're going to have to go backwards. We've grown in that sense. There's been too much growth, and we're going to be forced by global warming, whether it's peaceful or violent, to reduce the level of human output drastically, and that's going to really bring the inequality and and access to resources issues absolutely to the fore.
Which then gets to the question there. We moved a little bit off NAIRU now, haven't we? But it just, that general question about how do you run an efficient economy then to make the best out of resources, whether they are resources that are coming from the sun or whether they're human resources. How do you, what is the body that manages that to ensure that that is being done efficiently rather than just the broader economy? Is it the role of the Treasury? Is it the role of the central bank? Who does that?
Well, you've got to allow a certain amount of spontaneous order. Hayek's comment about what capitalism has, which is a real strength, and that's the complex system that capitalism gives you, that gives you a large part of its growth. You also need a government that knows what its actual role is, which where modern monetary theory is a sensible contribution. You've got to recognise the role of credit, which again we haven't incorporated into economic theory. So we've got people making policy decisions who don't understand government money, don't understand credit, and when it comes to where growth comes from, don't understand energy either. So it's hardly any wonder we're scratching our heads most of the time. I think we're going to be. We've had an appalling warm up for what I think is coming our way through climate change. And in the middle of that, we're going to realise we just can't afford to be as ignorant as we have been about how our economy operates and how it's part of the ecology. You do have to make policy decisions at a global scale, and we haven't done that either.
And, if we are getting big problems coming with climate change, then we're going to hit bigger problems as well with diversity of the economy, aren't we? Diversity of income. In the poorer people are going to be hit the hardest. But
and we can't afford that. I mean,
we can't afford that.
I think we saw the impact of just how bad that could be with the Gilets jaunes movement in France, because that was, that was triggered by Macron putting up a tax on diesel as to address global warming, and that caused riots amongst the working class and the self-employed
because they couldn't afford it.
They couldn't afford it. The burdens of climate change cannot fall on the poor. Period.
So. Doesn't this get to the problem that time and time again, central banks and treasuries and economists generally, society at large, tends to like one number. So we're looking at the NAIRU number and saying, well, okay, that is the percentages that we're going to accept as the top level of or the bottom level of employment, the point at which we start to see inflation. Now you could, even if you did accept that was a concept, it's going to be different for different groups of people, but we aggregate it into one number, and it's going to be less for rich and more for manual workers. Similarly, if we look at GDP, should we break GDP into income brackets and see how much each group is contributing, so we can identify within that number where consumption is falling, where productivity is falling. We need to start breaking up some of these numbers, don't we, so we can see what's really going on.
We do, yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, there is this mechanical desire amongst humans to have a single number, one ring to rule them all, sort of Lord of the Rungs as opposed to Lord of the Rings, and that tends to dominate how we think. And in the Keynesian, what were called the Keynesian days, when people bastardized the Phillips curve, and Phillips made the mistake of using this language himself, I must say. He talked about a menu. You could actually choose where you want to be on the unemployment inflation curve, which was the biggest mistake he ever made to make that comment, and that's how it was interpreted. You choose your combination of numbers. Then we had the NAIRU. Choose your unemployment rate. We have to understand that we live in an extremely complex system, and you can't reduce it to one number, and you have to see how parts of your system interact with others. And thinking about the economy and the ecology as interacting complex systems, it's not one number. It's the long-term viability of that matter more than anything else, and that's the last thing we're focused on, unfortunately.
So if you were, final question then today, if you were on the, imagine this, if you were on the Fed board, can you imagine all those central bankers there meeting, and in the middle of them all is Steve Keen.
I wear my leather jacket again just for fun.
Yeah, wear that too. And put on a dress maybe, just, be really esoteric.
No, come on, there's already been beaten to that by Janet.
That's true, yeah, but for a bloke doing it, just create a few waves. But if you were going through a period of 1 year review, which is what they've been going through, of monetary policy to come out the other end about what's going to change, what would you have been saying if you're looking at, incremental steps that, because you might well say, well, I think our monetary policy review should abolish us, and we shouldn't have central banks anymore, and we should just be an arm of the government. But if you're looking for,
I would make sure that by the time I had 1 year there, I'd make sure by the time I left, they had central bank digital currencies implemented, so that everybody in the country had an account at the central bank. And I'd set up in such a way that you could manipulate whether that was money was put inside there or whether carbon rations were put inside there. Because my real, if I think anything we desperately need, it's a way of reducing carbon consumption as fast as possible. Right. And carbon rationing is the way to go about it. So I would set up a digital currency in the bank and give everybody a bank account and be ready for what comes next, because without that, we'll be in total chaos. And unfortunately, I think we are going to be in total chaos.
Right. I did say baby steps, but that's fine. That seems like quite a big step, but we'll accept that. But it's a small step compared to what's coming. I'm sure that's what your point. Okay, and the focus on employment. What should they be doing there? If we're accepting the fact that NAIRU is not a steady number, what should they be looking at?
Well, again, we've got to think outside the world in which the environment is closing in on us. And, if you didn't have the environmental crisis, then you'd simply want to have a level of a high level of private sector employment. But accept its volatility and have a job guarantee as a way of meaning it. If the level of activity in the private sector falls, people don't lose either employment capability or income as much as they do at the moment. So, in that sense, I'm a fan of the universal basic income as well. But I think the job guarantee component of MMT is an important idea. If we had that, then unemployment would not be quite as disastrous as it is right now for individuals and for society. And
in fact, you could argue, couldn't you, the other way? Because if it is what's happening right now. Because if central banks say, okay, we think we're at the lowest level of employment possible, and we're not, and their response to that is to push up interest rates, they will slow down the economy and take away jobs from even more people, as well as not finding jobs for those people who'd been looking for them previously. So they'd be making the situation worse.
Yep.
That's not what we want from our central bank. All right. Very good. So I think we've concluded it's a nonsense. Good to talk, Steve. We'll catch you again next time. Thank you.
Okay, mate. Bye-bye.
NAIRU is a nonsense. That's basically the conclusion of the last 35 minutes or so, but central banks will hang on to it. That's it for today. That's the Debunking Economics podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie, back again with Steve Keen next week. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.